Walk Two Moons, Chapter 18, The Good Man. I should mention my father. When I was telling Phoebe's story to Gram and Gramps, I did not say much about my father. He was their son, and not only did they know him better than I, but as Gram often said, he was the light of their lives. They had 3 other sons at one time, but one son died when a tractor flipped over on him. One was killed when he skied into a tree, and the third died when he jumped into freezing cold Ohio River to save his best friend. The best friend survived, but my uncle did not. My father was the only son left, but even if their other sons were still alive, my father might still be their light because he's also a kind, honest, simple, and good man. I do not mean simple as simple-minded. I mean he likes plain and simple things. His favorite clothes are the flannel shirts and blue jeans that he has had for 20 years. It nearly killed him to buy white shirts and a suit for his new job in Euclid. He loved the farm because he could be out in the real air, and he wouldn't wear work gloves because he liked to touch the earth and the wood and the animals. It was painful for him to go to work in the office when we moved. He did not like being sealed up inside with nothing real to touch. We'd had the same car, a blue Chevy, for 15 years. He couldn't bear to part with it because he had touched and repaired every inch of it. I also think he couldn't bear the thought that if he sold it, someone might take it to the junkyard. My father hated the whole idea of putting cars out to pasture. He often prowled through junkyards, touching old cars and buying old alternators and carburetors, just for the joy of cleaning them up and making them work again. My grandfather had never quite gotten the hang of car mechanics, and so he thought my father was a genius. My mother was right when she said my father was good. He was always thinking of little things to cheer up someone else. This nearly drove my mother crazy because I think she wanted to keep up with him. But it was not her natural gift like it was with my father. He would be out in the field and see a flowering bush that my grandmother might like, and he would dig the whole thing up and take it straight over to Gram's garden and replant it. If it snowed, he would be up at dawn to trek over to his parents' house and shovel out their driveway. If we went into town to buy supplies for the farm, he would come back with something for my mother and something for me. They were small things, a cotton scarf, a book, a glass paperweight. But whatever he brought, it was exactly what you would have picked out for yourself. I had never seen him angry. Sometimes I don't think you're human, my mother told him. It was the sort of thing she said just before she left, and it bothered me because it seemed as if she wanted him to be meaner, less good. 2 days before she left, when I first heard her raise the subject of leaving, she said, "I feel so rotten in comparison." "Sugar, you're not rotten," he said. "See," she said, "see, why couldn't you at least believe I'm rotten?" "Because you're not," he said. She said she had to leave in order to clear her head and to clear her heart of all the bad things. She needed to learn about what she was. "You can do that here, Sugar," he said. "I need to do it on my own," she said. "I can't think. All I see here is what I am not. I am not brave. I am not good, and I wish someone would call me by my real name. My name isn't Sugar, it's Chanhassen." She had not been well. She had had some terrible shocks, it's true, but I did not understand why she could not get better with us. I begged her to take me with her, but she said I could not miss school and my father needed me, and besides, she had to go alone. She had to. Excuse me. I thought she might change her mind, or at least tell me when she was leaving, but she did neither of those things. She left me a letter which explained that if she said goodbye it would be too terribly painful, and it would sound too permanent. She wanted me to know that she would think of me every minute and that she would be back before the tulips bloomed. But of course, she was not back before the tulips bloomed. It nearly killed my father after she left. I know it, but he continued on doing everything just as before, whistling and humming and finding little gifts for people. He kept bringing home gifts for my mother and stacking them in a pile in her bedroom. On the day after he found out that she wasn't returning, he flew to Lewiston, Idaho, and when he came back, he spent 3 days chipping away at the fireplace hidden behind the plaster wall. Some of the cement grouting between the bricks had to be replaced, and he wrote her name in the new cement. He wrote Chanhassen, not sugar. Chanhassen, excuse me. 3 weeks later, he put the farm up for sale. By this time, he was receiving letters from Mrs. Cadaver, and I knew that he was answering her letters. Then he drove up to see Mrs. Cadaver while I stayed with Gram and Gramps. When he came back, he said we were moving to Euclid. Mrs. Cadaver had helped him find a job. I didn't even wonder how he had met Mrs. Cadaver or how long he had known her. I ignored her whole existence. Besides, I was too busy throwing the most colossal temper tantrums. I refused to move. I would not leave our farm, our maple tree, our swimming hole, our pigs, our chickens, our hayloft. I would not leave the place that belonged to me. I would not leave the place to which I was convinced my mother might return. At first my father did not argue with me. He let me behave like a wild boar. At last he took down the for sale sign and put up a for rent sign. He said he would rent out the farm, hire someone to care for the animals and the crops, and rent a house for us in Euclid. The farm would still belong to us, and one day we could return to it. But for now, he said, we have to leave because your mother is haunting me day and night. She's in the fields, the air, the barn, the hall, the walls, the trees. He said, we're making this move to learn about bravery and courage. That sounded awfully familiar. In the end, I think I merely ran out of steam. I stopped throwing tantrums. I didn't help pack. But when the time came, I climbed in the car and joined my father for our move to Euclid. I did not feel brave, and I did not feel courageous. When I told my story to Phoebe to Gram and Gramps, I mentioned none of this. They knew it already. They knew my father was a good man. They knew I did not want to leave the farm, and they knew my father felt we had to leave. They also knew that my father had tried, many times, to explain to me about Margaret, but that I wouldn't hear it. On that long day that my father and I left the farm behind and drove to Euclid, I wished that my father was not such a good man, so there would be someone to blame for my mother's leaving. I didn't want to blame her. She was my mother, and she was part of me. Chapter 19, Fish in the Air. Gram said, where did we leave off with Peeby? What was happening? What's the matter, Gooseberry? Gramps said. Did your snake bite your brains? No, she said. It did not bite my brains. I was just trying to refresh my memory. Let's see, Gramps said. Didn't Peeby want you to tell your daddy about Mrs. Cadaver and Mr. Berkway hacking up her husband? Yes, that's what Phoebe wanted, and it is what I tried to do. One Sunday when my father was looking through the photo albums, I asked him if he knew much about Mrs. Cadaver. He looked up quickly. You ready to talk about Margaret? He said. Well, there are a few things I wanted to mention. I've been wanting to explain, he said. I plunged on. I didn't want him to explain. I wanted to warn him. Phoebe and I saw her slashing and hacking away at the bushes in her backyard. Is there something wrong with that? He asked. I tried another approach. Her voice is like dead leaves blowing around, and her hair is spooky. I see, he said. And there is a man who visits her. Sal, that sounds like spying. And I don't think we should go over there anymore. Dad took off his glasses and rubbed them on his shirt for about 5 minutes. Then he said, Sal, you're trying to catch fish in the air. Your mother is not coming back. It looked like I was merely jealous of Miss Cadaver. There in the calm light of my father, all those things that Phoebe had said about Mrs. Cadaver seemed foolish. I'd like to explain about her, my father said. Oh, never mind. Just forget I mentioned her. I don't need any explanations. Later, when I was doing my homework, I found myself doodling in the margin of my English book. I had drawn a figure of a woman with wild hair, evil eyes, and a rope around her neck. I drew a tree, fastened the rope to it, and hung her. The next day at school, I studied Mr. Berkeley as he leaped and cavorted around the classroom. If he was a murderer, he certainly was a lively one. I had always pictured murderers as being mopey and sullen. I hoped Mr. Berkway was in love with Margaret Cadaver and would marry her and take her away so my father and I could go back to Bybanks. What I found most surprising about Mr. Berkway was that he increasingly reminded me of my mother, or at least of my mother before the sadness set in. There was a liveliness to both Mr. Berkway and my mother, an excitement, a passion for words and for stories. That day, as Mr. Berkway talked about Greek mythology, I started daydreaming about my mother, who loved books almost as much as she loved all her outdoor treasures. She liked to carry little books in her pocket, and sometimes when we were out in the fields, she would flop down in the grass and start reading aloud. My mother especially liked Indian stories. She knew about thunder gods, earth makers, wise crows, sly coyotes, and shadow souls. Her favorite stories were those about people who came back after death as a bird or a river or a horse. She even knew one story about an old warrior who came back as a potato. The next thing I knew, Mr. Berkeley was saying, "Right, Phoebe, are you awake? You have a second report?" "Report?" Phoebe said. Mr. Berkeley clutched his heart. "Ben is doing an oral report on Prometheus this Friday. You're doing one on Pandora next Monday." "Lucky me," Phoebe muttered. Mr. Berkeley asked me to stay after class for a minute. Phoebe sent me a warning message with her eyebrows, as everyone else was leaving the room. Phoebe said, "I'll stay with you if you want." "Why?" "Because of him hacking up Mr. Cadaver, that's what. I don't think you should be alone with him." "He did not hack me up. Instead, he gave me a special assignment, a mini-journal." "I don't know what that is," I said. Phoebe was breathing on my shoulder. Mr. Berkeley said I should write about something that interested me. "Like what?" I said. "Oh, a place, a room, a person. Don't worry about it too much. Just write whatever comes to mind." Phoebe and I walked home with Mary Lou and Ben. My brain was a mess, what with trying not to flinch whenever Ben brushed against me. When we left Ben and Mary Lou and turned the corner onto Phoebe's street, I wasn't paying much attention. I suppose I was aware that someone was coming along the sidewalk in our direction, but it wasn't until the person was about 3 feet away that I really took notice. It was Phoebe's lunatic coming toward us, staring right at us. He stopped directly in front of us, blocking our way. "Phoebe Winterbottom, right?" he said to Phoebe. Her voice was a little squeak. The only sound that came out was a tiny "er." "What's the matter?" he said. He slid one head into his pocket. Phoebe pushed him, yanked my arm, and started running. "Oh, my gosh! Oh, my gosh!" I was grateful that we were nearly at Phoebe's house, so if he stabbed us in broad daylight, maybe one of her neighbors would discover our bodies and take us to the hospital before we bled entirely to death. I was beginning to believe he was a lunatic. Phoebe tugged at her doorknob, but the door was locked. Phoebe beat on the door, and her mother suddenly pulled it open. She looked rather pale and shaken herself. "It was locked," Phoebe said. "Why was the door locked?" "Oh, sweetie," Mrs. Winterbottom said, "it's just that I thought that—" She peered around us and looked up and down the street. "Did you see someone? Did someone frighten you?" "It was the lunatic," Phoebe said. "We saw him just now." She could hardly catch her breath. "Maybe we should call the police, or tell Dad." I took a good long look at Phoebe's mother. She did not seem capable of phoning the police or Mr. Winterbottom. I think she was more scared than we were. She went around locking all the doors. Nothing more happened that evening, and by the time I went home, the lunatic did not seem quite so threatening. No one called the police, and to my knowledge, Mrs. Winterbottom had not yet told Mr. Winterbottom. But right before I left Phoebe's house, Phoebe said to me, "If I see the lunatic once more, I'll phone the police myself."